Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Danny.
And we're seriously nerdy about pod racing.
Wizard. We are fans and patrons of the YouTube channel Boylei Hobby Time, so when he put a challenge out to build our very own pod racer for this month's art challenge, we took it to heart. We started with bits and pieces that we already had, hoping to build this entirely out of trash. Some of it was IKEA pieces that we just had leftovers of. Some pieces were honestly just interesting trash that we saved, and some pieces were existing model kits that we saved in our bits box. The important part for a pod racer is that we had duplicates of everything to make 2 engines, and anything we had singles of could be converted into the control pod in the back. And if none of these phrases make any sense to you, it might be worth mentioning that pod racers are a reference to the 1999 Star Wars film The Phantom Menace, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. I broke out my Star Wars visual dictionary to make sure that we had as many elements of our pod racer authentic as possible. So that includes elements like air scoops, the fins at the front on the engines, to control cables that connect the engines to the control pod. We even made sure that we had stabilizer cones so that our engines would not be unstable. And as fun as it was to make sure that all of our elements stayed within the Star Wars lore and story canon, we also just had a great time combining pieces that looked cool, like a toothpaste cap and a deodorant holder, in ways that established that same Star Wars visual language that we're used to. Our pod racer combines twin engines at the front that are connected to a control pod in the back that's perfect for our racer. This is Pithra, or at least she's going to be. Right now, she's an existing game figure that we happen to have in our bits box. She's from a game called Folklore: The Affliction, but we are going to turn her from the Huntress game figure into a Murielin, which is a race of Star Wars alien known for these intricate tattoos that they get on their faces that reflect their personalities and pursuits. Pithra's tattoos represent her quick reflexes, and when she travels the galaxy pod racing, she's never far away from her Vulptex companion, Benjal. Now, if you're familiar with Star Wars: The Last Jedi, you know that these crystal foxes inhabit the planet of Crate, and they are adorable. Technical term, adorable. Alex happened to have printed a fox in clear resin, and it seemed like a great time to turn this clear fox into a crystal fox, using some white and blue paints and some UV resin for crystals. So we sort of had a pod, we sort of had our racer and her furry, crystal-y companion, so we turned our attention to what the diorama that would be that surrounds the pod, and for this we knew we'd need some scatter terrain. Thankfully, Star Wars Legion tabletop game has expansion sets that come with wonderful little details like this comms tower, and this, along with a few other pieces of actual Star Wars miniatures, helped us turn our very trashy diorama into something that looks incredibly authentic to the Star Wars universe. But don't get us wrong, we love a kit bash, which is why we also use things like thin sheets of green stuff material to make a little shade structure for Benjal to sit under to avoid the heat of the Tatooine suns. But we also use that same green stuff sheet to make a flag, because it turns out that flaggers, the folks that walk across the course with flags, are an important part of pod racing culture. The flags represent each of the racers, sort of like the Star Wars version of heraldry or a coat of arms, so we wanted to make sure that Pithra's flag represented her. We haven't seen a lot about the planet Muriel in the Star Wars universe, so we took some creative liberties and established this yellow and brown color scheme. We also thought it might be difficult for Pithra and Benjal to handle the pod on their own, so we decided to introduce a droid companion. This is an R4 series, also from the Star Wars Legion set, and when we were trying to decide what to paint him for his color scheme, we were inspired by a very deep-cut R4 droid. This is R4E1, who is seen for about 3 seconds in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. We love a deep cut. We also love the magic of priming something so that it doesn't look like it's made of trash. Isn't it amazing what a coat of black primer will do? So for the color scheme of the control pod as well as the engines, we used that same yellow and brown color scheme that we established on Pithra's flag. For the accents and callouts, we pretty much just watched episode 1 many times to figure out what other pod racers had for their racing stripes and color callouts, the amount of weathering, even things like what colors of metal certain pipes and cables were. The conclusion that we came to, which is the conclusion for most things we design that live in the Star Wars universe, is that the amount of distress and weathering is really what makes something look like it lives in the Star Wars universe. So we were not shy with things like oil drips and dust and rust buildup. Those are the details that have always made something go from being generic sci-fi to aesthetically Star Wars. The really neat thing is that after everything was base coated and we started to put the detail and weathering on, I stopped being able to see the individual components and started to see the pod as a whole. So I'm no longer looking at an end cap from an IKEA chair and a washer left over from furniture assembly, and I'm starting to see it as a pod racer as a whole. That is the magic of kit bashing, when they are no longer individual elements, but they become the sum of their parts. So along the way, some of the lessons that we learned were the importance of using different adhesives in order to get all of these pieces of trash to stick to one another. Sometimes we used 2-part epoxy, sometimes we used super glue with accelerant, sometimes we used UV resin, and that was really the trial and error process of this build to get all of these pieces of trash to stick to one another. For the diorama itself, we used our Glowforge to print what we're calling a stage. It consists of a base plate and some side panels that will elevate it high enough for us to fit our electrical components inside. We used some leftover styrofoam pieces just to provide some height and hills, and then a combination of wood glue and plaster of Paris for the base itself. Once that was dry, we slapped on some Mod Podge, a couple pebbles, and a coat of snow because we didn't have enough sand to cover the base. The irony is not lost on me that in a diorama depicting Tatooine, there is no sand, because as Anakin Skywalker likes to remind us, we don't like sand. It's coarse, it's rough, and it's irritating, and it gets everywhere. So instead, we're going to use snow, and we're going to paint it like sand, and that's going to be just fine. You'll also notice that we left a couple empty spaces here for the panels so that we can access the on and off switch for the electrical later. We're still getting used to the on and off switch that's accessible thing. Definitely a work in progress for us, but here's to trying new things. The smaller panel is a dummy panel, just to sell the idea that it's definitely embedded there in the ground. The larger panel will be the one that we use to access the on and off switch. We used a quick magnetic jig just to glue the sides of the base in place here before we turned our attention to electrical. If you've followed any other makers on YouTube, you may see a lot of interest in these flexible LED filaments. They're basically light up spaghetti noodles. We saw them, we loved them, we waited a month for ours to be delivered, but boy are they exciting. We are going to use the flexible filaments to create our energy binder in a yellow arc of energy between the two small generators. We also used a thin filament of neon plastic as well as some UV resin squiggles to create that electrical static burst that comes off of the power coupling. We'll wrap these around the filament to make them look extra electric. And now for gravity magic. We know the pod has to be suspended, and we know that our pod's not currently being raced. So we thought, maybe, with enough glue, we can use wires that look like cables sitting on the ground to suspend the engines and the control pod above the diorama, giving the illusion that they are floating in midair without having to hide support rods. Full disclosure, I did this without testing, just hoping and believing that it would work, and thankfully it did. Because our diorama is telling a little story and features lots of props around the scene, you don't think too much about piles of cable lying on the ground. But those coils of cable are in fact what is holding up our Podracer engines and control pod. Once everything was thoroughly glued into place, I could come back with any final detail paint to represent shadow and oil spill, and of course, put Benjal in place. After that, All that was left to do was our final wiring to make sure that our filaments and our support light still worked, and glue it on to its final base. In the words of Boylei Hobby Time that inspired this build, we called it good.